Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Allen, and today I'm going to be discussing competency to plead guilty. So what is competency? Competency to stand trial in our class, what we're focusing on is a legal judgment about the ability of a defendant to, one, understand the legal proceedings, and two, participate in their own defense. So of the criminals referred for a CST assessment, which is a competency to stand trial assessment, 70 to 80% of them are determined to be competent. And of those who are not determined to be competent, 75% of them are restored to competency through treatment and are able to be retried. So a good majority of those that go through a CST assessment are determined to be competent or are able to be brought back to competency. So there are two categories of competency. There's decisional competence, which is the competence to make a particular decision, and there's adjudicative competence to proceed. So a defendant must understand and participate in the legal process. So decisional competence is basically what is used in competency to plead guilty. That is a type of decisional competence. So just one quick little side note, a thing that I feel we need to know is something called a parens patriae authority. And so that is if a defendant is unable to make a decision for themselves and has no one to make a decision for them, this usually involves children, then the state can initiate parens patriae authority, which allows the state to make a decision for the defendant and act as his or her guardian. That's not really relevant to my particular subject, but I felt that that was an important thing that we need to remember for future reference. So going back to competency to plead guilty, over 90% of all criminal cases are resolved through a guilty plea without trial or verdict. So when making this guilty plea, a defendant must understand the charges against them, the penalties for those charges, and the rights he or she are waiving by pleading guilty. For instance, the right to remain silent, the right to confront one's accusers, the right to a jury and a trial, and the right to counsel. So if one of these three mentioned above are not competent, if one of these three mentioned is not understood by the defendant, then they are not considered competent to plead guilty. So there are a few court cases that kind of helped mold the standard for pleading guilty. And so the first case we're going to talk about is Sealing versus Amen, and this happened in the 1990s. So they kind of endorsed the concept that a person who pleads guilty needs to understand the charges against him or her, consequences of those charges, and the constitutional rights that they're being waived, as mentioned before. But this case also emphasizes that the degree of competence required to make a guilty plea is higher than that required to stand trial. So you have to be more competent to be able to plead guilty than you do to stand trial. That's kind of what that's the conclusion they came to. And then the next case is Godinez versus Moran. So Godinez versus Moran, this ruling, excuse me, completely rejected the Sealing versus Amen case. They stated that a person who is competent to stand trial is also competent enough to plead guilty. So in this case, they're both equal. You don't have to be more competent for one than the other. So there are arguments against both of these cases. The argument against the Sealing versus Amen case that kind of creates an issue of competency. So defendants who have been found competent to stand trial but not competent to plead guilty kind of become vulnerable to the prosecution because at that point they're unable to participate in the process of plea bargaining. So that's kind of bad for the defendant. And then the Moran standard, that kind of creates an issue of competency regarding reasons for pleading guilty. So in the Moran standard, courts are not explicitly required to assess the issue of the difference between rational and irrational reasons to plead guilty. For instance, a defendant could say, I plead guilty because I signed a confession. That's rational. Or I plead guilty because I'm the worst sinner in the world. That's kind of considered an irrational reason, but the courts don't pay attention to these reasons at all in the Moran standard. So there's an assessment that we use to kind of address all of these issues called the McCapka. This evaluation determines competence to proceed as well as whether the decision to waive rights and plead guilty was autonomous. So a defendant with an impaired autonomy is typically due to either a mental illness or severe altered mental state. So an example of a defendant with an impaired autonomy, they could say, I plead guilty because the space aliens told me to, or I plead guilty because I don't care what happens to me. So both of those are due to either a mental illness or severe altered mental state, and that is considered to be impaired autonomy. So there are a few discussions regarding the METCATCA. These discussions, Mr. Richard Bonney with the University of Miami in 1993, he stated that if both the defendant and the defense agree, and the defendant understands the process and rights being waived, then the defendant's reason for the plea is not necessary. The only way they would need a reason is if the defendant and the defense do not agree. So that's kind of one discussion that went on about the METCATCA. And then another one is from Christopher Slobkin, which is one of the editors/authors of our book, and Amy Mashburn in 2000. They stated that the guilty plea should be accepted if the defendant understands the process and gives rational reason for the plea. So they say that both should be required. And if both are met, then the plea should be accepted no matter what the defense attorney says. So they kind of have a bit of a different opinion on that aspect. And then there are two more cases that kind of caused a huge discussion. They didn't necessarily change the standard, but they caused a huge discussion regarding the concept of competency to plead guilty. There's Bordenkircher versus Hayes. The prosecution in this case gave the defendant two choices: to plead guilty and serve 5 years in prison, or to be charged as a habitual offender and receive a life sentence. So this court in this case, they determined that that was not considered unconstitutional because the habitual offender charge was legitimate and the defendant did technically have a choice. So he did have his free choice. I personally think that kind of backed the defendant in the corner. I'm curious to see if you guys agree, if you think that backed them in the corner, kind of didn't really give them a choice. Really, I mean, they had two choices, but is that much of a choice? And then the second case is Brady versus the United States. Excuse me. So in this case, the defendant was given a chance of pleading guilty for a life sentence or the death penalty. Again, not much of a choice, but the defendant claimed that he pled guilty for fear of the death penalty. But the court in this case stated that the defendant's fear may have caused the plea, but it didn't coerce it. So I'm curious to see, do you guys think it was coerced? Do you think, it was justified, or do you think it was coerced? I personally think it was coerced. Again, the court deemed that it wasn't. So just curious as to what you guys think. And then, so the video I have attached here, warning, it is quite disturbing, and it does involve children, this case. So I guess viewer discretion is advised. There's nothing, visually disturbing, but the case itself is just a little messed up. So it's of a mother who tortured and murdered her two young children and then stuffed their bodies in a freezer. But she was found competent and pled guilty to the charges. And there's a psychiatrist kind of towards the end of the video that discusses the process of her case and, and how they decided her competence. So I highly recommend, the link is in the end and the resources as well. I highly recommend watching the video. Again, it's kind of tough to watch, but it does explain a lot regarding competency to plead guilty, and it's quite an interesting watch. So discussion questions, other than the two from those cases that I asked, those are just kind of little curiosities. So my discussion questions are: do current standards for the determination of autonomy prove a defendant's competency to plead guilty? And should the standards for the determination of autonomy in defendants be more flexible or less uniform? Why or why not? These are just kind of questions that popped up in my head while I was learning about competency to plead guilty, and I'm just curious to see what you guys think about them. These are my resources. Let me move my little video. So these are my resources, of course, our book, and then the Godinez versus Moran case. I was able to find it online. And then that last one is just my source for that YouTube video of the case of the mother. So again, I highly recommend it. Hope you guys enjoyed my presentation, and I look forward to watching yours.